Herzlich willkommen zu 99 zu 1. Welcome to 99 zu 1. My name is Nadim and it should be showing here on the screen. I don't know why it isn't, but I will check that in a sec. Welcome to our second episode on this book, Hezbollah, Mobilization and Power, written by Aurélie Daher. We had the last one coming out a week ago. Back then when we recorded that episode, Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, wasn't dead yet. He wasn't assassinated yet. So we're going to talk a little bit about this too. But before I bring Aurélie in to discuss in this episode and in the next episode a little bit about, let's say, the reasons for Hezbollah's popularity. And in particular, in this episode today, we are going to focus on Hezbollah as a military force and as a successful military force. That is one of the reasons why it's so popular. But before that, let me give a short intro as to who Aurélie is. We are going to do this in every episode now. So in case you jump in now, you get to know a little bit about her. Aurélie is a French, English, and Arabic-speaking academic who teaches political science and sociology of conflicts at University of Paris Dauphine. I'm always going to butcher these names. Institut Pratique de Journalisme and Sciences Po Paris, I think. She holds a master's degree in public management for ESCP Europe, as well as a master's degree in political science, a DEA in sociology of the Muslim world, and a PhD in political science from Sciences Po Paris. And her research obviously focuses on Hezbollah, Middle Eastern Shiism, Lebanese, and Middle Eastern politics. We're also going to talk some current events today, of course. She also works on new aspects of the Middle Eastern jihadism and its repercussions on European societies. And with that, and without further ado, let's bring her in. Welcome back, Aurélie.
Thank you. Thank you. Bonjour, guten Tag. And by the way, let me congratulate you on your French.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I hope my French teacher watches this. A French-speaking person commended me on my French. Yes, I'm very proud. I can die in peace.
She did a great job.
No, she did not.
She did not.
Sorry. Anyway, yes, let's come back to the important topics. Aurélie, I already gave a short intro. We're going to talk a little bit about the reasons for Hezbollah's popularity in Lebanon.
Okay.
And today, it's also part of your book deals a lot with its military successes and with the aspect of Hezbollah being a military organization. But before we get into this, maybe I don't think we should not comment a little bit about what happened last week. So, of course, there was before the assassination of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, there was these pager attacks, and then we had all these bombings going on, and then of course the assassination not only of Nasrallah but of basically all the leading staff of the organization. So we've been hearing a lot about this is basically, that's supposed to be it for Hezbollah. That's the end game. It's over. It's going to decline. Hezbollah is just a matter of time until it falls. What do you think about that? Do you think Hezbollah has entered a declining phase? Is it close to the end? Are we about to see a totally different Hezbollah in the near future?
So I'm not going to say that Hezbollah wasn't hurt, okay? That wasn't affected, that wasn't seriously impacted by what happened in the last few weeks. But I think we also need to look at a broader picture here because, I have been hearing as a scholar who has been working on Hezbollah for quite some times now. We're talking decades. My first work on Hezbollah, my first thesis was in 2002. So I have heard a lot and read a lot over the years about Hezbollah's imminent end, and so many times in the last 30 years that honestly I cannot remember. And I would say that in a way, already in 1992, so more than 30 years ago, so the political literature, the media, politicians, whether in Lebanon or outside Lebanon, they were already all about Hezbollah not having long, before it would completely disappear, because in 1992 in Lebanon, it was the year where the whole political institutional life resumes, was back in the saddle after the war, after the civil war. We had a civil war in Lebanon that lasted for 15 years, from 1975 to 1990. And Lebanon suspended all legislative and local elections for actually quite a while because of the war. So in 1992, we finally had the first post-war legislative elections. And everybody was surprised to hear that Hezbollah decided to join, intended to participate for the first time in its history. And there was that theory, super popular, which considered that Hezbollah's involvement in national politics would be the end of it as a military, but also as a fundamentalist religious group. The idea was that power, or at least participation in politics, would kind of teach Hezbollah moderation, but also realism, adjustment, and that eventually, the hope was the leadership and the cadres would become, good old bourgeois in all the anti-revolutionary sense of the notion, and that they would become way more interested in the petty, internal, inter-sectarian political games. They would fight for resources, money, etc., and eventually they would become way too lazy to keep up with the armed resistance against Israel. And, over the years, and to everybody's surprise, nothing of that happened. And then in 2000, when the Islamic resistance, so the military organization attached to Hezbollah, when it finally freed South Lebanon from 22 years of Israeli occupation, same thing. We had like an avalanche of papers explaining that the raison d'être, the reason for Hezbollah's struggle, was gone. So Hezbollah was going to naturally dissolve, probably out of retirement or out of boredom, God knows. Anyway, and same thing, it didn't happen. And then very quickly, we heard like the same. It's like the same old song, being played all over again, but like at a higher pace. Because we had 2003, when the American neoconservative administration toppled down the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the whole thing was about actually forcing regime change in the whole Middle East, at least in a large part of the Middle East, under the banner War on Terror. And Israel at that time insisted in Washington, D.C., that either Lebanon or Iran should be next, because in both cases that could help Israel get rid of Hezbollah. And again, a lot of people were predicting, the imminent end of Hezbollah under American pressure or direct action. Same thing 2 years later, 2005, Syria leaves Lebanon. It's the end of the Syrian tutelage. And by the way, it's funny how people quickly totally forgot that for quite some time, everybody was presenting Hezbollah not as the proxy of Iran, as much as the proxy of Damascus, of Syria. So now it's all about Hezbollah and Iran. Nobody's talking about Hezbollah in Syria anymore. And everybody was like, okay, Syria has left Lebanon, and March 14, which is the anti-Assad coalition, political coalition in Lebanon, won the elections that year. So bad news for Hezbollah. They're just gonna, have to accept to become, a little political party on the side and stay in their corner. Didn't happen. Same thing after 2006, the 33-day war. And I remember actually a discussion with a French former ambassador who said to me, a year or two after the war, oh, now, with Hezbollah being so weakened by the 33-day war against Israel, I really wonder how they're going to survive politically, etc. But I think the worst in terms of predicting Hezbollah's death was probably with the start of the civil war in Syria. So we're talking 2012, 2013. The whole planet for a while was predicting the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And then when the unrest turned into something armed, into something more military, and then the Islamic resistance eventually jumped into the battlefields on the sides of the regular troops of Bashar al-Assad starting 2013. A lot of people were already celebrating what they saw as soon to happen massive death of the resistant combatants and its disappearance in Syria. So it is important to keep in mind with what is happening right now. We need to really put that in its historical context, take a little bit of height, I would say, time-wise, and try to, rather than just, again, predict something because we would like it to happen, maybe we need to try to evaluate a little bit more in details and in a more cold way, non-emotional way, try to evaluate in which way this situation today is different from what we saw before. And even more importantly, I think that the real key to foreseeing Hezbollah's future, I don't think it lies into the depth of its current wounds. I think it lies into what makes Hezbollah's strength and resilience. Because at the end of the day, wounds, you can recover from wounds, even if you're going to have some scars, So I think the real question is to go back into what makes Hezbollah's strength and resilience and check whether those levers, those pillars of Hezbollah's strength and resilience, especially at the military level, and especially in Lebanon, whether they're intact or maybe just a little bit scratched, or whether they are in serious disarray. Because as long as the pillars of Hezbollah's or the roots of Hezbollah in the Lebanese society, Lebanese politics, its military strength, as long as the roots are still kind of, functional, still there, the core of it is still there, then I don't think Hezbollah is going to go anywhere. And actually, it might even recover more quickly than what a lot of analysts may think.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about Hezbollah as a military force. So how does one have to imagine this? Because, even saying military force, it's like most people here, I think, just imagine they're, some insurgent terrorists basically running through the hills or something like that. So how would you present that? Like, if you were to explain what Hezbollah is militarily speaking, like as a military force, like how many men do they have? What types of weapons? Like, there are people saying they have hundreds of thousands of rockets, and what kind of rockets do they have? Like, what can you say if you want to characterize them as a military force?
Yes, that's definitely something that is a little bit obsessive, or we can read quite a lot of obsessive papers in all sorts of strategy oriented think tanks, etc. That's definitely something that is the West is wondering a lot about. But in the same time, how many men, what kind of weapons, how many of each type? That's the 10 million, if not $10 billion question. Rather than think of Hezbollah as a terrorist group, well, at least in terms of shape, what it looks like as a military force, I think we should really look at it as an army, okay? With battalions and specialties, they have the guys who are specialized in that type of explosive, the guys who are specialized into, electronic intel, guys who are, infantry, etc., etc. They're organized just like that. Now, in terms of, again, the size of that army, the number of battalions, the number of military leaders, because we heard the Israelis brag about the fact that they killed the whole or most of the chain of command in the military apparatus of Hezbollah. But, at the end of the day, nobody except for Hezbollah and the Islamic resistance has a clear idea of how many men are enrolled in their ranks, whether civilians or military. No one knows what type of armaments they have, how many equipments, rockets. No one has any idea of the budget that they allow to their military effort. And honestly, I don't want to offend anyone, but anyone who would come forward with numbers saying, this is it, basically, they shouldn't be taken seriously. And if I say so, it's also because it is all the more because I discovered through my field works that, going to the field and talking with Hezbollah of all sorts over the years, I eventually came up to understand and to discover that there is a unit within the security apparatus of Hezbollah whose job is exactly that, which is to put on what I call the intel gossip market all sorts of rumors and fake information about
disinformation
capacities. Yes, absolutely. Fake information about the military capacities of the Islamic resistance. So every month they just spread new rumors, and the level of the variation between the versions, the variation can be so big that eventually, you're in a complete fog. You have no idea which one is close to the truth, mildly true. You don't know. So when, when mainly it's American and Israeli think tanks, when they come with all sorts of stuff on those topics, I wouldn't trust that. Plus, I think there's another dimension to that question. That whole obsession with, we need to know how many men they have, how many rockets, how many battalions, because that will be the best way, obviously, to block their capacité de nuisance, to know a little bit better what kind of enemy we're facing and know basically how we're going to be more effective at defeating them. That obsession of the West with the military capacities of Hezbollah, that's my analysis, but it's all the less relevant because if you look at the victories of Hezbollah over Israel, those victories were not made most of the time thanks to the equipment or number of men of the Islamic resistance. That's not what made the resistance successes over the Israeli army. In 2000, and then again 2006, even in 2006, if we take a look at the rockets that were used, the equipment, they had very modest ranges for quite a long time. Even in 2006, they couldn't reach beyond Haifa.
These Katyusha self-made things.
Exactly. And I remember when they even started, I don't know if you mentioned that, we mentioned that in the first episode, I don't think so. But I remember like in the 90s, in the early 90s, when Hassan Nasrallah basically took over the organization, the way they would organize their attacks were very basic, that like they would hide a Peugeot car most of the time, French car, behind a big rock, and they would bring a cable, log it or to the battery of the car, and then they would try, to spread the cable as far as possible, and they would do that kind of a cocktail Molotov, a very basic, explosive kind of thing, and they would hide it, between two rocks, on the track of the Israeli Merkavas, of the Israeli tanks. And if they manage to basically even just hurt, not a wheel, because I don't know how do you call in English
these chains, the chain.
In French we call the trenis, basically.
The chain of the tank, basically.
Exactly. If they could just damage a little bit the chain of a tank, that was wow. They were going to celebrate because that was the big prowess of the week. So at the end of the day, and again in 2006, the Islamic resistance, they didn't have any DCAs, they didn't have tanks, they didn't have military planes. And by the way, they still don't have planes. They do have those drones, but they don't have planes, so they cannot go, for instance, and do what Israel does and bombard heavily like Israeli cities, etc. No, Hezbollah's successes militarily have always been about the quality of their tactics, of their strategy, and psychological warfare. They're very good at psychological warfare. And on the opposite, especially Hezbollah is very good on the ground. They're excellent ground field combatant. And on the opposite, if you look at the Israelis, let's take a few seconds to compare what they have to the Israelis. The Israelis, for instance, they're very good, with the technology. They can bombard heavily a city, etc. But they're not good at all on the ground.
That is known, basically, that anytime they went for ground warfare, they basically got bloody noses always. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a reason to that, because it is a strategic choice that was made by high-ranked officials. I think it was 20 or 30 years ago. The idea was to really bet everything on technology through major destructions, and not making, obviously, any difference between military and civilians. And actually killing civilians is something that is done on purpose, and that's something they are perfectly okay to recognize. They admit it, they acknowledge it. The idea is to attack the civilians on purpose, so that would put pressure on the government of their countries, so the governments would do what Israel cannot do, which is to put a leash.
They call that the Dahiya doctrine, even.
Yeah. The Dahiya doctrine is about, like, it's not just about killing civilians, it's also about, like, completely destroying a city or a neighborhood. And the idea is to put pressure on the government, so the government will put either Hezbollah or Hamas on a leash. So the idea for Israel now, and has been so for quite a while, the idea is to kill the enemy from a distance, which is actually, if you think of it, it makes sense in the sense that it is both easier to manage in terms of number of casualties, because obviously their soldiers are in safe places when they are attacking the enemies. Basically, when you're an Israeli soldier, you don't face your enemy, you don't put yourself in the way of harm, you don't get wounded, you don't get killed, because the Israelis also have that 0 wounded or 0 dead doctrine. That's very important for them. There's another, obviously, advantage to that, is that killing from a distance is way easier for their soldier to manage their potential guilt or culpability, because obviously they kill the enemy without seeing them, and that helps at dehumanizing the enemy and not feeling driven into questioning the morality of what they do. So it makes sense. I mean, it's just strategies that are different on both sides of the barricades. But Hezbollah's victories over Israel was not really, I mean, about equipment or even number of men. I remember, during the last days of the 2006 war, when finally the last 3 days, after a whole month of useless bombarding of Lebanon, eventually the Israelis realized that they were not going anywhere, that none of their announced aims was reached. They decided to go for the vast offensive during the 3 days, and they put on the ground of South Lebanon 40,000 men. 40,000 men on 10% of a country that is itself 1/3 of Belgium. So that's quite a lot. And in front of them, they had only, according to the best estimations, 5,000 Hezbollah guys. So we're talking one Hezbollah guy for 8 Israelis. And basically, the Israelis raised the white flag, 48 hours later. So it's not about equipment as much as it is, again, I think, about strategy, having a perfect mastering of the ground and having good tactics and mastering psychological warfare.
All right. I mean, in your book, too, you argue that it's basically like one of the most important aspects for Hezbollah's popularity are these military victories of the military wing, the Islamic Resistance of Lebanon, explaining basically why Hezbollah became so popular in the eyes of a lot of Lebanese. And to be honest, I can even, like, we are Christian, my family is Christian Lebanese, even for some of them, it's like, it's not only Shia people that are fans basically of this. So I wonder, though, I mean, even if we go back to the last bigger offensive, which is 2006, when they basically drove Israel out after the 33-day war, that's already like nearly 20 years ago. If you go back to 2000, which is the liberation of the occupation in South Lebanon, that's even more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So I wonder, is it like, can the popularity really be derived from something that is already, so long ago? Does that live in their memories so vividly?
Yes, that's a good question, because you're right. We have like more than one generation, almost 2,
right,
already came since, and they never either knew the war, they were too little, too small, too young to remember or to have felt like they were impacted by that. But that's the thing. It's not just about military prowesses. That's the tipping part of the iceberg. 2000 and later 2006. But let's start with 2000. 2000 was not just any historical event. It's not just a moment of, obviously, relief for the end of the occupation and collective pride. We won. No. 2000 brought a solution, but not just to one problem, which is, again, the occupation. It brought a solution to another problem that is way more psychosociological. It put an end to a trauma. And by the way, that's not just a Shiite trauma. It brought an end to a trauma into a complex, an inferiority complex. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So the trauma in particular, the inferiority complex is a little bit more ancient, but the trauma itself goes back to 1982, and the realities of the Israeli occupation, okay? And that reality in its details. Again, the devil is in the details, or at least in some details, but because those details are structuring ones. I remember we mentioned in the former podcast that we dedicated to the origins of Hezbollah, we said that the invasion of 82, had two kinds of objectives, okay? One was Palestinian-centered. It was about, uprooting the Palestinian armed force that settled in Beirut, especially in the early 70s, among whom was Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO. Himself. Now, those forces basically established a kind of a state within the state, a kind of sovereign space in South Lebanon, and the Palestinians used that space to, launch their attacks and their resistance operation against mainly the north of Israel. But another goal of the Israelis was Lebanon-centered. The idea was to completely modify the internal, domestic situation in Lebanon. They wanted to give the reins of the country to an extreme right, ultra-nationalist Maronite, coming from, who was at the head of a very important, the main, actually, Christian militia. That militia was called the Lebanese Forces. And that militia actually was an ally of Israel. It was the main ally of Israel in Lebanon. So the Israelis wanted to do that. And finally, they had their own little agenda, which was to amputate at some point. They thought of amputating Lebanon of its south, that is very fertile, that is very rich in water, and annexate it into turning it into the new north of Israel. Now, problem is that the south of Lebanon, in terms of confessional communities, is very diverse. We tend to say it's Shia, yes, mainly, but it's really very diverse. So, as you said, the Christians eventually supported Hezbollah, but Sunnis, Druzes, Catholics, they were all living the same thing. And so very early on, after the invasion, Israel basically strengthened its presence in the south. It really walked very quickly. It advanced very quickly. So signs multiplied that showed that it's not just an occupation, it's an annexation. What does that mean? Well, to start with, Israel gave the dossier, the Lebanese dossier, back home in Tel Aviv, not to the Ministry of Defense, not to the Defense Department, but the Ministry of Interior, the Home Department. It's a very telling detail because people who work on, the sociology of armed conflicts know it's very frequent that in situations of occupation, it is back home. The occupiers in the occupiers' country, it is the Ministry of Defense that takes over the management of occupied territories. And correct me if I'm wrong, but for instance, the West Bank in Palestine, for instance, is run or kind of dealt with by the Defense Department in Israel. It's not the Home Department. Now, in Lebanon, from the beginning, the Lebanese dossier never entered the building of the Defense Department. It was immediately a Home Department thing. And immediately the Lebanese who were originally from the area, we were given what the Israelis called the yellow cards. It's a little bit like a little yellow passport, cardboard, basically kind of ID papers written in Hebrew, and no one in South Lebanon read Hebrew at that time. And they were delivered by the State of Israel, and that gave the holders the possibility, at least at the beginning, to, and under certain circumstances, to get into and go out of the occupied area. Now, the area itself, the occupied south, very quickly again, was completely severed, completely separated from the rest of Lebanon, the rest of the country. Israel actually, ironically, called it at some point the freed Lebanon, the liberated Lebanon. And Israel, all the same, very quickly also started to reorganize the demographics of the area. So, for instance, Christians, especially pro-Israeli Christians, were the ones who were like Lebanese forces friendly. They were offered, for instance, jobs in Israel. So
explain quickly what are the Lebanese forces? Give this context, please.
Okay, so it's a Christian militia, mainly Maronite, but not only, but mainly Maronite, that was created by a guy called Bashir Gemayel, son of Pierre Gemayel, brother of Amin Gemayel, who eventually became president in Lebanon in 1982. And Bashir had initially that basically he joined the civil war with that idea of, he had different agendas. So obviously he wanted to get rid of the Palestinians. He considered that we had too many armed Palestinians in Lebanon, and actually not so many people, even outside the Maroc community, discussed that. The Lebanese at some point, all of them were a little bit tired of the fact that the Palestinian armed forces, especially after 1970, Black September, were not answering the Lebanese government and were kind of considering that Lebanon was a kind of a second Palestine and they could do whatever they want. So at some point that was okay. But the problem is that the idea was also to basically give to the Maronites back the upper hand in Lebanese politics over the territory. There was some talk about reorganizing the borders of Lebanon. There was that idea of him becoming a president, and between the executive power that at that time was in the hand of the president, and then a major presence of the Maronites in the parliament that would have been kind of reserved the whole state apparatus to the Maronites. And eventually he became, a warlord. He had a very special way of dealing with political violence. He had his own signature in terms of, torture, very brutal, very violent, ended up with the nickname, the Butcher of Beirut, Jazzar Beirut. So, that's the Lebanese forces.
I mean, two interesting things: Sabra and Shatila. So, if anybody knows of these massacres, they were the ones who perpetrated this under the auspices of Israel, of course. And the interesting thing about, you just talked about how they were rearranging this. After 2006, many of these guys that were in the Lebanese forces and used to work in Israel actually stayed in Israel until today. There are whole neighborhoods in Israel where you can drive through and you say, okay, these are Lebanese forces. They are brought in by the Israeli state.
Yeah, I hear a lot of them opened falafel restaurants in the north of Israel.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. So I think we were talking about the yellow cards, okay, and the fact that basically what is it that Israel was going to do with that population that is very mixed. So they kind of, first of all, sorted them out. They are the ones we want to keep and the ones we want to get rid of. So, that kind of Christians, obviously not all the Christians were Israel friendly, and a lot of them actually joined all sorts of, most of the time, left-wing resistance organization. It was not just a Shia thing, okay? So the people who were Israel friendly were given jobs in Israel. They were offered, for instance, to learn Hebrew. They were encouraged to spend their holidays, their breaks in Israel. And the others, mainly Muslims, but as I said, also Christians who didn't want to collaborate, they were encouraged, quote unquote, in so many ways to basically leave South Lebanon and never return, because South Lebanon was becoming the north of Israel. And the Israelis were very creative. They had so many ways, many techniques to have people leave. First of all, one thing they did, and they did that as soon as the first invasion, the one of 1978, they recruited a local militia of Lebanese. They paid them, they trained them in order to harass the populations, to racketeer them, to do all sorts of dirty jobs on behalf of the Israelis. And for a very long time, the Israelis kept saying, that's not us, it's just Lebanese, going after Lebanese, it's Lebanese, torturing Lebanese. So a little bit like when Ariel Sharon commented on Sabra and Shatila, said the Israelis have nothing to do about it, it's just Arabs killing Arabs. That basically that's not our problem. So all the same, the Israeli army itself, like so many times on a regular basis, would besiege, bombard towns and villages until people surrendered, and left. They even literally deported quite a number of towns and villages, entire populations. They were simply right on the spot, out of nowhere. You could see like the Merkavas coming by the dozens with trucks, and they would, the Israelis would force people into getting in the trucks with nothing more than basically the clothes they had on, and they were either thrown brutally on the other side of the border into the other part of Lebanon to the north, or they were deported to Khiam, which it's a huge prison that was run by the Israelis in South Lebanon. And for those who stayed, basically what the Israelis did is they made their lives kind of impossible. They did all sorts of things to disgust people, to discourage people from staying in the area. And I'm going to give you a few examples, and that's things, for instance, that are well documented, but I can talk also from my experience because, my family is from South Lebanon. And at some point, even if my parents directly, uncles, aunts, cousins, etc., basically we ended up, like many people, dispatched a little bit everywhere, whether in Lebanon or outside of Lebanon. But from time to time, like my parents would take us to the south, to see the old timers, the grandparents, etc., to go and go to the cemetery and pay our respects to the dead and to our ancestors. And basically, the Israelis had. So I saw a few things. I witnessed so many things. I went through so many things. So, for instance, one thing the Israelis would do is that they, as I said, they were interested in the water and the land of South Lebanon. So first thing they did is that they installed like water pumps on all the water sources of South Lebanon, okay? And obviously mainly the major ones. And that water, the water of South Lebanon, okay, was being, like for years, it was diverted and sent directly to the taps of regular citizens in their homes in North Israel. In the same time, the people of the south had serious water issues. They couldn't have water for themselves, drinking, washing, etc., bathing. But also, it's a very agricultural area, so they didn't have enough water, for instance, to water their orchards, their plantations, etc. So they lost basically their way of making a living. The Israelis for ages denied, we never stole the water, never existed. It's just Lebanese propaganda. But what happened is that in the spring of 2000, when they left so rapidly, they left by, the French expression is par nuit sans lune. They just left by some moonless night, okay? And they just left, and they left all the pumps on the water sources for everyone to see. So that was documented afterwards. And obviously, as you can imagine, Hezbollah immediately came and dismantled all the pumps. And that was the end of the Lebanese water, irrigating the north of Israel. Something that they would do, like very frequently, happened so many times. You can have so many testimonies about that, is that they would come into onto people's property, private property, and it would come by force and take earth. I'm talking soil, fertile soil from the south, and we're talking dozens of tons each time, and take all that back to Israel, whether, they would use it, for state purposes, or they would sell it at gold prices, and in stores reserved to, gardening, stuff like that, like the soil from Lebanon is the best,
So you're saying they would come with a digger basically and just dig up earth and take it from your garden or something?
I saw it with my own eyes. So I remember like one evening we were at, having dinner. My grandparents had like a little bit of land in front of the house, and there's that, we're having a family dinner. I don't know, it was around maybe 9-10 p.m. and it's all quiet, and suddenly you hear that loud noise and the ground starts shaking. So here comes the big Merkava, the big Israeli tank. They enter your property and you see Israeli soldiers around the Merkava. And they obviously, immobilize you at gunpoint, and you're in the middle of your meal, and there are children all over the place who obviously panic, and the parents cannot do anything about it. And then you see, like, to what we call in French Caterpillar. Obviously, that's the name of the brand, but it's what. It's like those big,
like a digger truck with these arms.
Exactly, those digger trucks with that round-shaped shovel, would come in, and nobody would dare to move, and they would just grab whatever they want from your land just in front of you. And once they would leave, believe me, the hole was big enough for you to build a swimming pool in it, and that would happen like all the time. And so, you also had like all sorts of things. You had like, they tried to force people into collaborating, which is, by the way, a regular technique, I would say. But you had so many situations in so many, like all the towns or the villages that were occupied. Like, for instance, you had young men, young women who were forced to have intercourse with the militia working for Israel, what we call Jaish Lahb, actually. So the South Lebanese army. People were forced into collaborating, and if you didn't want to, if you tried to resist, it's either they were going to threaten your family. They said, "Okay, you don't want to have sex with me, I'm going to rape your daughter. I'm going to rape your father. I'm going to rape whatever," or they would threaten to destroy your house. That's also a technique. By the way, that's a technique they also use a lot in Palestinian territories, and they had even a law. They called it, I don't remember if it's because it's a weird, the phrasing is weird. So it's the present absent or the absent present.
Yeah, absentee law or something like this. Yeah, we have
exactly.
that. We have that in Palestine too. Yeah,
exactly. And they applied exactly the same thing. So the idea was, for instance, if your old parents who remain in the village went to visit you outside, the area, went out just for a few days to visit you, or to go to a doctor. Okay, they needed to see a doctor. The idea was, if you're not back in 48 hours, your house is now officially property of the state of Israel. And
they call it in German Weggang, Platzvergang. We say something like you get up from your spot, you lose your spot.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. In French, we say qui va à la chasse perd sa place.
Yes, something like that. Right.
Anyone who goes hunting loses their seat. So the point, obviously, was to prevent anyone, from either leaving the occupied area and feel miserable, and then, you would feel so miserable that you would leave and ever dream of coming back. But there's another thing that they would do, is try to prevent people who were originally from the area, went out, and then eventually wanted to come back. And the way they did it is, at some point, as I said, the Israelis completely severed South Lebanon from the rest of the country. And there was just a few, 2 or 3 passages you could take to enter the occupied area. And so the Christians were allowed to come by boat, from the sea, but Muslims should come on foot through what we call Mafra Zamraya. And I swear to God, there are so many Lebanese, even till today, when you say before them Mafra Zamraya, just the name of it, the little hair we have on our forearms or on the back, on our back? Goosebumps. Exactly, goosebumps, just from the name of it, because all sorts of horrible things would happen on that checkpoint. People of both genders, of all ages, were regularly raped under the excuse of, I have to do a full body search for anyone who would try to get in. And obviously, when you're a parent, okay, after a while, you're going to stop going to the South. You're going to stop taking your kids to the South because, your kids are becoming teenagers, etc. And every time you want to pay a visit to your grandparents, basically you're taking the risk to have, your teenagers or your young adults or even your children being raped. So you stop coming, and at the end of the day, and that's documented, at the end of the day, between the deportations, the forced departures, and the loss in birth, okay, South Lebanon in 22 years of Israeli occupation lost 75% of its population. 75% of its population.
Right. I want to come back to something you mentioned, because that's also interesting. When I read the book, there was a moment where, like, 2 days before I came to that passage, I read something about this State Taiman prison in South Israel that basically currently houses most of, if not all of, the prisoners from Gaza. And, you know, all these horrible detention practices and torture and rape and all this stuff. I mean, it was a big thing in the news, right? And then I got to the point in your book where you speak about Khayyam prison. You just mentioned that too. And it was really eerie how similar the description were that you gave there. And as you said, I mean, that's 30 years, 40 years earlier, but you said it was quite an important tool of social control in South Lebanon. Like, can you explain a bit more about this prison, because that's also very notorious?
Yeah, you know, actually, Khayyam was eventually catalogued as, believe it or not, they don't circulate a lot, but if you really look for them, you'll find them. It's more military literature, I would say. But at some point, you have reports documenting all the illegal prisons, political prisons, and centers of tortures that you might have on the planet, or we might have had in the last 30 and 40 years. And Khayyam was number one ex aequo. Khayyam actually is not the name of the prison. It became the name of the prison, but it's a little town. It's a little village in South Lebanon. But the complex, the prison was set on its land. And actually, some scholars even don't consider it as a prison. They literally say it was a concentration camp. So the premises actually are quite vast. We're talking 50,000 square meters. So that's nice. Initially, they were used by the French during the Mandate, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They were used by the French to establish their stables. This is where they put the cavalry put their horses. So in the stalls, basically, those little places where you put your horses, they were turned into isolation cells. And when the Israelis invaded the south, they took over Khayyam, and they obviously put their hand on the premises. And they turned the whole premises into a huge place to stock, their Lebanese prisoners, starting 1984. And the International Red Cross was not allowed in until 1995, for more than 10 years. It was impossible for the Red Cross to come in. Israel, until 1995, always denied the existence of a Khayyam. Doesn't exist. We vaguely heard about something. Again, it's Lebanese running a Lebanese thing. We're not there. That's not true, because all the witnesses, all the people who survived the camp always said, like, during the interrogation, Israeli officers were there, and yes, you had the Lebanese collaborators doing the dirty work, but the Israelis were running, obviously, the place and the whole sessions. So people were parked there for times that lasted between, according to the Red Cross reports, 3 months to more than 10 years, without any official accusation, obviously, no right to have a lawyer. And actually, there's a movie. I don't know if you saw it, if you watched it. It's called Incendie. It's a Canadian movie that supposedly takes place in Lebanon. And at some point, the female hero of the movie is incarcerated in a prison, and that's Khayyam. Basically, it's inspired. The whole movie is inspired with, or is built, or at least that scene, that part of the movie is based on the real Khayyam. And the Red Cross later on eventually called it the prison of shame. The Lebanese, they had another word for it. They called it the center of hell, Markaz al-Jahim. And they had a saying about it, which is actually, it rhymes. So it might sound a little bit funny when you hear it, but actually it's quite tragic. And the saying goes, اللي بيفوت مفقود اللي بيطلع مولود, which means anyone that enters Khiyam should be considered as lost forever. No need to have hopes, basically, for that person to come back. And anyone who gets out should be seen as resuscitated, as miraculously coming back from the dead. That's basically the idea of the saying. And inside the Khiyam, you had tortures of all kinds. Obviously, the prisoners were beaten, interrogated naked, systematically naked. They were bit by dogs. They were tied for hours, like with their hands to pillars. They were hanged by their wrists for nights long, either in winter cold or under burning summer sun. They were deprived from food, sleep, which is, you're going to say, well, this is classical. They were waterboarded. They were raped by interrogators. They were raped by dogs. They were raped with electric devices. So you had electric torture. You were beaten. You had also all sorts of testimonies about being beaten and raped before your families. So they would bring the families in to basically, and they would either rape the prisoner in front of their kids or rape the wife in front of their husband, etc. And what is even more chilling is that we have some very serious reports about the Israeli pharmaceutical industry doing tests on the prisoners. So it's well known that the pharmaceutical research in Israel is one of the main pillars of the Israeli economy. And for years, the Israeli industry, the pharmaceutical industry, used the prisoners in Lebanon as guinea pigs, to test, obviously quite freely and in all discretion, all sorts of medications and medical products, obviously without the consent of the guinea pigs. And you're probably, you're too young, Nadim, to remember, but some of the people in your audience will probably remember in 2004, we had a lot of noise in the international news about the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Abu Ghraib.
I'm flattered that you think I'm that young, but no, I do remember very vividly.
Oh, you do remember? Oh my God. So that means that your parents politicized you a bit too early.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you were already watching horrors at 10 years of age.
No, I'm actually older than that. I think 2004 I was 21. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I can accept. Okay, so you remember Abu Ghraib?
Yeah, I do.
And
sure.
then and there were like those horrible pictures that circulated on the internet that were taken by American jailers running that detention center in Iraq for Iraqi prisoners after the invasion of 2003. And those pictures obviously showed all sorts of torture scenes of humiliation that were utterly disgusting and inhumane. And it turns out, again, you can find it easily. It's documented. It turns out that most of the torture practices that were repeatedly used by the Americans in Iraq and Abu Ghraib were actually invented and tested by the Israelis in Khiyam on the Lebanese detainees before becoming a kind of a textbook that were taught by Israeli consultants to the American officers who were sent to Iraq. It's like you have so many reports and testimonies about that. And, talking about all that, there's someone who just came to my mind right now. So I remember that very particular interview when I was doing my research for my PhD. I had an interview with a former person, a young man, or he was a young man at that time, who spent time in Khiyam. He spent time in. And it was a few years after he got out. And he said that the Israelis had a little kind of nasty habit. It was a kind of a private joke between them that they would play on many prisoners. So they would systematically strip the detainees naked during the interrogation sessions, males and females. And some of the Israelis would smoke during the interrogation sessions, and they would burn with their cigarettes. They would burn the Star of David, the symbol of the Star of David, on the chests and the backs of the detainees. And that person I talked to explained to me that the Israelis would do that, and they would tell the detainees, well, in case by some miracle one day you get out, you will never forget about us. Now we are with you, we are in you till, the day you die. And even when you will, excuse my French, okay, I'm quoting, even when you will F your wives, we will be with you in the sheets of your beds. And at some point during the interview, the person took off his shirt to show me, which I found was a little bit awkward, because usually, between Lebanese, you don't do that. A man is not going to, show a part of his body naked to a lady he's not married to or who's not part of the family. But obviously the guy was, very emotional about it. So he took off his shirt, and guess what? So at the first look, I didn't see anything. I didn't see the Star of David that he was mentioning. What I saw was the whole chest and the whole back were completely burned. Like, I'm seriously burned. And the person then explained. And he said that when he finally got out at the liberation in 2000, obviously he had time to recover. And then his family organized a party to celebrate his return and the end of the occupation. And then he said that late in that evening, at the end of the party, he told his brothers and his cousins to go with him to the garage at his parents' place. And there he showed them packs of cigarettes and lighters. And again, he took off his shirt and he asked them to completely burn him until the Star of David would not show anymore. And they did just that. And eventually, the end of the story was that the person said to me, I was in front of him. I was completely traumatized by his story. But eventually, he had that little, joyful moment, a kind of revengeful moment at the end of the interview, where he said, now when I have sex with my wife, it's just two people in the bed, because we liberated our land, but my bed also has been liberated. And why? Because obviously those stories are absolutely abominable. But at the end of the day, this is where Hezbollah gets back into the picture. Because if you don't take those stories, those experiences that happened under occupation, if you don't take them into consideration, then you will never understand where Hezbollah came from, why people support Hezbollah. You never understand why basically Hezbollah still have, the back of those people, and those people have Hezbollah's back. And, eventually, according to several scholarly estimations, between 10% and 15% of the Lebanese population of the South at some point spent time in Khiam. What does that mean technically? That means that then, but also till today, no one in Lebanon, or everybody in the south of Lebanon, either went themselves or had somebody they know, a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a husband, child, a friend, that spent time in Khiam. Khiam impacted everybody in the south, Christian, Muslim alike. So you don't take those stories into consideration. You consider like that's not that structuring, then you will never understand basically the whole Hezbollah phenomenon and the longevity of that loyalty of a lot of people in South Lebanon to Hezbollah, because they're perfectly able to criticize Hezbollah, say, okay, Hezbollah in this is not perfect, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, the way they see it is, we waited the Lebanese government to do something, and obviously they didn't have the means to. The Lebanese army couldn't free them, and then they waited the international community to do something about it, to put pressure on Israel. And guess what? The Israel community never asked about them for so many years. And the only one who put an end to all those horrors was Hezbollah. So, not only they are grateful to Hezbollah, but they're teaching their children that loyalty to Hezbollah, because we also know something in psychology, is that at the end of the day, traumas are transmittable. You can transfer a trauma from a generation to the next, even if the next generation has not themselves experienced the cause of the trauma. So the trauma is maintained in time, and with it, the loyalty for the party that put an end to it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's very relatable. I mean, as a descendant of Palestinians, we basically have the same thing about being, deported in the Nakba and all this stuff. Maybe returning, not returning, etc. And that gets passed down generation by generation. But at the same time, and maybe that's like a small comeback. It's like, you still have, like, maybe not in the first generation, but maybe, with the grandkids or something like this, you do have more people that just say, leave me alone with this stuff. That is over. Mm. I don't want to be, a fanboy of a militia anymore. I don't want to talk about, Palestine anymore. I just want to live my life or whatever. Right. So I wonder, because now it is already 20 years ago that they actually did, that took part in a war on the soil of Lebanon and for the sovereignty of Lebanon, let's say. Mm-hmm. Is that not also declining in the sense of, Hezbollah is losing its popularity maybe in the population?
Well, that's true. You do have a part of the new generations who, in a way, and basically that's not just a Lebanese thing. If you look, I was talking about it with an Armenian friend, and he was talking about the way the generations after the genocide reacted. So there's a part of the community that chooses to remain loyal, to the souvenir, to the memoirs, to the dead, and maintains, the trauma, and others are running away from it,
they want to
try even to kind of wash off. Right. Their Armenian identity. So you do also have that in Lebanese, especially the young generations, and even amongst Shia, they haven't lived the war, and they feel like now it's 2025, the world is moving, it's social media, it's economic prosperity, and it's having fun and ta. So you do have that. But I was talking about the trauma, and I was talking about the inferiority complex. So I realized that I didn't elaborate on that. As I said, so obviously the liberation in 2000 created a lot of gratitude and support. And of course, the whole talk in the West about Hezbollah, terrorist organization, that wasn't credible or acceptable from a Lebanese point of view, at least for a lot of Lebanese, and especially those of the South or the Shia areas. They ended up trusting Hezbollah way more than they trust Lebanese politicians or foreign diplomats. But again, more importantly and more persistently, the 2000 liberation created something else. Not just in Lebanon, by the way, but in all over the Arab world. So, a little bit of history, so very quickly. So since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, so the Arab armies, let's call a spade, whatever they were, they had been systematically defeated. Each time they went into an armed fight with Israel. Okay, in 1956, in 67, the Six-Day War, in 73, October or Kippur War. Every time the Arabs, the regular armies, meaning the governments, the states, were defeated, the whole pan-Arab discourse about the solidarity and all the Arabs, flying towards Palestine to save the Palestinians, basically it became kind of a fart in the wind. More and more Arab territories ended up being occupied by Israel. And if Israel at some point, for instance, sometimes withdrew from certain Arab territories, I'm thinking, for instance, from the Egyptian Sinai, it was always in exchange for something else. It was because Israel was giving back something, but was giving back as a victor, taking something that meant way more to Israel than those territory. And in several cases, the Arabs even had in return to sign a peace treaty, right, with Israel, or let go of a certain number of things to Israel. And with Hezbollah in 2000, something very weird happens, something we never saw before. Because it was, and guess what? It is still 25 years later, almost. It is the first time and the only time that Israel left an Arab country, an Arab territory, first of all, defeated, not victorious. Second, they weren't even defeated by a regular army, by a militia that was considered, even in its own country, kind of a weak group of weird people, uneducated bumpkins. That's the way they were depicted. Plus, they had to leave and they got nothing in return. And this is where something way deeper than just the joy and the gratefulness of the Shia or pro-Hezbollah people came in. Because we talked, if you remember, we talked in the previous podcast that the Shia of Lebanon before 2000, they had always been what we call the communauté des périphéries, the community of peripheries, and all the meanings of the sense. They live mainly in the south, or the extreme south, or the northeast. So it's either next to the border with Israel, next to the border with Syria, or they're in suburb of Beirut. They're not even inside the capital city. And for many decades, that's a sociological fact, they were, in terms of human development, the least advanced community in Lebanon. They had the higher fertility rate among all the Lebanese community. That's not the case anymore, but that was like that for many decades. Their lands were far from the political, economic, cultural center of the country. They lacked schools, hospitals, electricity, running water, etc. They were also the least educated. And that they had a lot of inferiority complexes towards the other Lebanese. And unfortunately, the other Lebanese could be very mean with them, with the Shia. And I think that in a way, at some point, those Lebanese are kind of paying the price for that now. And in the popular representations of a lot of Lebanese, being a Shia, as I said, like rhyme with being, backwardish, illiterate, kind of a savage. And when Hezbollah came, Hezbollah didn't just bring, the liberation. Hezbollah came with another image of the Shia. Came with the discipline, dedication, hard work, education, commitment, patriotism. And that liberation was a kind of the cherry on top that triggered another kind of liberation, but this time not a land liberation, a human, psychological, collective liberation, in the sense that it triggered a profound identity-based revolution in the minds of the Shia community. So the Shia were no longer looking at themselves as the B-rank kind of Lebanese, the uncivilized ones, the crypto Lebanese that still needed to prove that they were worthy of belonging to the Lebanese nation. Now they had paid the high price. They succeeded where the Lebanese army, all the other Lebanese resistance groups failed. They even succeeded where all the Arabs failed. Okay, so they suddenly, became from it's like in a classroom, where the last guy, the guy with the worst grades, suddenly at the final test, gets an A+ and becomes even better than everybody that was supposed to be, the first ones in the class. So they became from we're not sure they're Lebanese to suddenly they are the super Lebanese, right? And that is thanks to what Hezbollah just achieved. So they suddenly realized that they don't have any reason to doubt themselves, to let the other Lebanese or the world, in that matter, talk down to them. And that created a bond between Hezbollah and its public and its supporters, Shia or not Shia, that in a way remains intact till today.
Right. I have one other question that I'm not sure whether it fits now, but if not, we can also just take it to another episode. But I'm still going to ask it because when I speak to people in Lebanon, especially people in Syria, but also people in Palestine, when it comes to Hezbollah's popularity, if we talk 2006, 2000 for sure, but 2006 until, let's say, 2011 or 12, it was basically ubiquitous, this kind of feeling of, they are the ones who finally, stood their ground against Israel, and that's why a lot of people paid respect for them. Yep. Do you think that the engagement of Hezbollah in the Syrian civil war that you already mentioned, did that have any repercussions for Hezbollah's popularity? Because until today, even when, Hassan Nasrallah gets executed and some people mourn, other people in the comments or somewhere, will always come like, but the butcher of Syria is dead or something like that. So what can you contextualize this a bit? If it's not too big of a question, we can have it somewhere else.
No, it's an excellent question. 2012 to 2013 brought, like some uncertainties and especially at the beginning. Even within the Shia community, where initially, the supporters, the, real unconditionally supporters of Hezbollah suddenly ask themselves, like, is it really our war to fight, next door? Obviously, they didn't want, most of the Shia didn't want Bashar to fall, not for love of Bashar, because the Syrian tutelage didn't leave, great memories to the Lebanese. Like, all the Lebanese were happy, in spite of what, the appearances might have looked, and that split between 8th of March or March 8 and March 14 coalitions, the pro-Syrian, anti-Syrians. At the end of the day, all the Lebanese were happy that the Syrian tutelage came to an end in 2005. But all the same, the idea was maybe Assad is going to be the less of two evils. We don't know what's going to come next. Now, initially, yes, the popularity of Hezbollah had a moment where it became really shaky. First of all, for two main reasons. Because at the end of the day, fighting with on the side of Bashar's troops also brought Hezbollah into situations that tarnished its reputation of being, the saviors of the weak, etc. We had situations where, for instance, the Islamic resistance was taking part in besieging towns and villages where civilians were bombarded, where they couldn't, they couldn't have access to food, etc. And that even actually brought some question within the organization. What kind of put Hezbollah to a certain extent back in the saddle, at least in the Lebanese Shia community, is 2014, when Jabhat al-Nusra, so Al-Qaeda in Syria, and Daesh attacked Arsel. We had like lots of attacks against Hezbollah, and even the Christians, Sami Jaja, even the patriarch, the Maronite patriarch, were very severe. The Sunnis were very severe about the intervention of Hezbollah in Syria. And if you remember, like, we had bombings, attacks, explosions in Dahi, in the southern the southern suburbs of Beirut, because obviously Daesh was kind of, punishing Hezbollah for its involvement in Syria. So everybody was blaming Hezbollah at some point for bringing chaos into Lebanon. And then after 2014, when it happened, just after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, because the attack happened in August, but end of July, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi announced the Islamic State. And he announced the ambition, the territorial, the geographical ambitions of the Islamic State. And suddenly in Lebanon, a lot of people, especially the minorities, the Christians, started to say, oops, do we really want that revolution in Syria to succeed? Because we might be next. And guess what? The months after that, joint attack from the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra and Arsel. They abducted regular military people in Lebanon and policemen, police staff. Eventually, the Islamic State executed their hostages. Hezbollah managed to negotiate to have the detainees by Jabhat al-Nusra go back. And that kind of put an end, at least in the Christian milieus and in the Shia milieu, to the voices that were publicly criticizing Hezbollah for their intervention in Syria. That does not mean that they're happy, but eventually they started to say, we don't have a choice, or if Hezbollah hadn't gone there, it would have been way worse, and stuff like that. So the less of two evil, but that does not mean that they're happy. Now, on the Sunni side, things are a little bit more complicated, in the sense that the war in Syria brought something else. The war on Syria was also a moment where that rivalry between Sunnis and Shia was exacerbated. And that Saudi Arabia, this is also, a few years later, this is where Saudi Arabia was taking all those steps, to basically contain what it saw like the Iranian influence in the Middle East. So they started, to bombard Yemen, and they abducted Saad Hariri in 2017 because of that. And then before that, they cut their diplomatic relations with the Iranians. So that's also a moment where the Sunnis in the Middle East were kind of encouraged to basically stand against the Shia power or any manifestation of Shia victories, Shia prowesses, Shia, etc. And this is where basically we also started to hear like a lot of people, mainly Sunni people, who used to support Hezbollah, turning against Hezbollah. So yes, it's a tricky impact, I would say, on Hezbollah's popularity.
Got it. I mean, maybe one last question. It's maybe that's a quick one because it's probably also not known yet, but it would be interesting to know what you have heard. How is Hezbollah's popularity doing right now? As Lebanon, Lebanon being bombarded in a way that it hasn't been bombarded before ever like that. Yeah. I think the 2006 war was like 1,600 dead, and they like in 1 week caught up to this and already like closing into the 2,500 or something like this.
Yes,
and also with a determination to complete disrespect for any kind of contagion. So-called collateral damage. So I don't know. Yeah, Hassan Nasrallah is there. Okay, we're going to kill 1,000 people just to get to this guy. They also didn't do that 20 years ago. Yeah. Yes. So it all seems kind of really escalating. So what about its popularity now? Are people now saying, "Man, Hezbollah, what did you bring on us? Why did you shoot the rockets over? What do we care about Ghazi? Should we not just let it go?"
Actually, we heard that a year ago already. At the very beginning, when Hassan Nasrallah on the 8th of October said, we're in, a lot of people were like, again, that's not our problem. But the thing is this, people who supported Hezbollah continued to support Hezbollah, and also because they kind of always trusted, especially after 2000, 2006, Hassan Nasrallah. So even if they were not sure it was, or some of them weren't sure whether, or couldn't see really why it was a good idea, etc. They trusted Hassan Nasrallah. They thought, he knows what he's doing. Every time we doubted him, we realized that we shouldn't have. 2000 we doubted, in 2006 we doubted, in 2012 we doubted. And at the end of the day, he's the wise guy.
Extremely respected, charismatic person.
Yes,
extremely.
Quite a lot. Now, those who obviously hated Hezbollah obviously have more reason too. The thing is, within right now, we have a kind of national consensus, and a trans-confessional consensus, to at least, as long as we're not out of the tunnel, leave our internal differences and aside, and not voice our critiques. Not basically, the idea is we have a kind of we agreed on not provoking anyone, not going after anyone, not saying, I told you, see, it's even worse. Like this is not the time to settle score. Okay, everybody agreed on that. Even today's head of the Lebanese forces, Amir Jaja, who's a very, very loud anti-Hezbollah person, and that's a first. So the thing is, the question, obviously, there will come a time when the Lebanese will have that discussion, okay? And probably scores will have to be settled, at least. That might be a little bit a rocky discussion. The thing is, in the same time, I am wondering whether the death of Hassan Nasrallah is paradoxically not going to kind of temper a certain number of critiques, because strangely enough, I think that's my thesis, and I haven't heard it anywhere yet. The death of Hassan Nasrallah is not good news for the people who hated Hassan Nasrallah, because Hassan Nasrallah at the end was at the head of a major mobilization machine, a major military machine. But the Lebanese, at the end of the day, could, feel safe around it, whether they were Shia or not, pro-Hezbollah or not. The problem is now we don't know who's going to take over in the next coming months. in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. What we're sure of is that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of time, Hezbollah will still be there. And the question is, we're not sure we're going to have somebody as patriotic, transconfessional, moderate, keen to maintain the civil peace at the head of the organization. So far, provocations by the enemies of Hezbollah, who would go, after the Shia, provoke the Shia, call the Shia all sorts of names, launch campaigns saying those guys are not Lebanese, they're Persians, etc. So far, Hassan Nasrallah had a policy towards that. Like his philosophy was, as we say in French, le chien aboie, la caravane passe. Let the dog bark, and the caravan at the end of the day just goes through the same way. So don't mind the critiques. Don't answer to provocation ever. Okay, don't answer the provocations. And at the end of the day, we're all one people, etc. Solidarity between the Lebanese. And by the way, Hassan Nasrallah always said that everything the Islamic resistance achieves, it's offered to all the Lebanese. It's not just for the Shia to keep. The young generations of Shia are not as patient as my generation or the generation before mine. It was a kind of, the Shia who are in their 40s or 50s, 60s today, they were kind of raised with the same idea of, everybody looks down at us, everybody talks down to us. We just wait and not answer. The problem is that the young Shia now, I'm not going to say they want blood. That's not the case. But they are more inclined, I would say, to answer to the provocations. They're proud now of being Shia. They sometimes can be themselves very provocative. You have all sorts of stories about, young Shia, on their motorcycles going all the way to Sunni areas, Christian areas of Beirut and just shouting, Shia, Shia, Shia. We're Shia, 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 basically screw you. We didn't have that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. So we have young Shia who are not maybe patient as they used to be, or their elders were. If they're provoked, you're not going to have the, wise voice to tell them, calm down, guys. We might not have a person that is charismatic enough at the head of the organization to even say, guys, I want everybody to go home. And maybe, guess what? He won't be listened to. They're going to say, I'm not listening to the head of Hezbollah anymore. I'm just doing my thing. So it's not necessarily a good news for the anti-Hezbollah to have lost Hassan Nasrallah. And the way I see it is, if some people really try to create some really serious unrest in Lebanon by provoking the Shia, probably they're going to learn very soon that for the sake of everybody, they're going to have to learn actually to keep their voice down way more than during or under the mandate of Hassan Nasrallah.
Okay. Yeah, that was a quite heavy episode, but I think it's very important to talk about all these details when it comes to understanding where its popularity from a military perspective comes from. We are going to make a second episode around the question of its popularity in Lebanon, focusing more on, and that's the other part of also of your book, which is like the social aspect of Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. So how do they actually contribute to social well-being and what they did on the ground? So that's going to be talked about probably then in the next episode, and a few more episodes coming. But for now, let's leave it at that, right, Aurélie?
Sure. You're the boss.
All right, folks, then thanks for listening. Thanks, everybody, for writing your comments and your feedbacks. By the way, we're collecting comments and questions, and at some point we maybe do a Q&A episode with Aurélie, and then we can bring them up. So feel free to shoot at us. Aurélie, thanks again for being here, and see you soon, all right?
Thank you for the invitation. Bon courage.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.